we're about to talk about, I think, this intersection of some of these problems, right? This protection of our data, that we all hear about this as a drumbeat all the time, our data, our data, our data. It's critical. This question of privacy being fundamental to what this future internet might look like, what this future internet of value might look like, because now we need to protect real money that is in data form. But at the same time, we need to identify ourselves. We've got this problem of ID. We need to be able to trust the other entity of some sort. So we're at this intersection of digital IDs and privacy, and all of it revolves around trust. Travis Jarae, CEO of One World Identity, who's been dealing with this stuff for a long time, is going to come out and bring out an excellent panel to talk about these things. Thanks, Travis. Take the seat.
Thank you so much. And I'll actually invite all the rest of the panelists to come up with me right now. Bimal, Joe, and Rob, come join me up on stage here.
All right.
Yeah, we'll give them a round of applause. Thank you. Yeah, all right. Very good. Okay, so good afternoon. Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, I'm that guy. Thanks. So we are here today to talk about the Holy Grail, digital identity, trust, and privacy. I'm sure you guys have already been talking a little bit about this, not just today, but over the past couple years as privacy regulations have started to roll out across the world, really. GDPR, CCPA as of January 1st. So this is obviously something that's very near and dear to many of us in the room. So a little bit about myself. So as you can see up there, I'm Travis Jarae, founder CEO of a company called One World Identity. We are a research and strategy firm focused on this space. Previously, I ran identity and digital identity for Google. So got to launch Google across the world, specifically with the Google Wallet products, Google Play, YouTube, etc. So really have seen the evolution of this space over the past 10 years. And I'm really excited to have these folks up here with me to talk more about that. But we are at an inflection point. 2020 is a huge year for us. I think it's safe to say that we are at a point where the digital identity and our physical identities have really started to converge. Us insiders have been using that lingo for a while to get on stage at conferences, but now it's actually starting to happen. And we're starting to see that every day as more regulators and legislatures decide to talk about this and make this as a key point of their campaigns or something that they want to enforce for their constituents. Obviously, this is not about governments or this is not about regulation. However, the consumers are directly impacted by that. And of course, the lawyer on the panel will talk a little bit more about that. So what is digital identity? I'll try to define that. It hasn't really been fully baked in the world yet. We all still debate about what digital identity is, but to oversimplify it is the digital attributes that represent a person, a thing, or an entity. So this could be anything from a username, a password, it could be your biometrics, it could be your sentiment analysis from your Twitter account, right? So it's anything that we can use to really understand who you are and what you're doing. And so I'm actually going to invite one of the experts in the space here, Bimal. He's the CEO of Uniken, a customer-first security platform. Not only that, they've been building omni-channel authentication software for years, and probably one of the only people that I know that's been building software that really takes privacy to heart. So I actually turn it to you to give us kind of a brief on what is this space, why does this matter today, and why are we talking about it with this room?
Sure. So, privacy and identity are an interesting concept because over the last 10 years, people have really taken a physical world identity and tried to transition it to the electronic world. And that's interesting because that's your name, it's your persona, it could be, your attributes. And then something called privacy came along the road. It started with GDPR, and now it's coming into CCPA. And it's saying, what information about yourself are you giving up? How is that information being shared and utilized? So if you think about it, from a security perspective or a fraud perspective, we all walk around with our mobile phones, and the mobile phone has become sort of the authenticator of choice. But a lot of people have been using that mobile phone and the attributes on it to create a digital identity of that phone as a proxy for you. And then they track the usage of that across institutions. Well, guess what? Under GDPR and CCPA, that's really not legit because it's kind of taking all the information about you, commingling it, sharing it, and then using it. So that creates an issue. Personal information creates an issue because people get hacked. Institution gets hacked, and that data goes out. your physical resemblance, while it's one of the most convenient forms, has its own challenges. I think we're going to hear about how you overcome some of those challenges. But taking that to a broad mainstream presents a different set of challenges. And under some privacy things, that could also create problems. So when we looked at the problem, we said, how do you create something for a consumer and build it for the consumer? So most security platforms in the world have originated as enterprise solutions to protect an enterprise or an enterprise user, and then migrated to the consumer space. So privacy was never an issue. If you're a company and it's an employee, they have no privacy. It gets complicated when you get into a consumer world. So we sat down 5 years ago and said, let's build something as if we were the consumer. What would we want? Which is zero friction, a similar experience across any channel, so interoperable, if you will. And then first and foremost, protects the privacy and all of the data for me, not to be confused with putting it into my own hands, as self-sovereign identity might, but really just creating invisible security that protects privacy. And when we started doing that, I think you had asked me a question 2 years ago. He goes, well, you think businesses are really interested in that? And 2 years ago, frankly, I would have said maybe. But in the last year, I think the world has woken up to that, and actually woken up to it much more outside of the US than in the US. I would say if you want to know what's happening in identity, look outside the US. And from last year being on stage here with about 15 million users, we have 65 million users on the platform right now, and accelerating at that pace, all because consumers are waking up to privacy, or more importantly, regulators are waking up to privacy. And I think there could be a big seed change if the regulators and legislators become a little more active in the space.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good segue into the rest of the conversation, of course. And we're going to introduce the rest of the panelists here now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually ask all of you guys to say your name, what you do, and then one either fun fact or a talent that only your friends know about. So you get to share some stuff today.
Let the lawyer go first.
Can't wait.
Well, my name is Joe Cutler. I am a partner at Perkins Coie, which is a law firm based in Seattle. I'm out of our Seattle office. And I kind of grew up as one of the first waves of privacy lawyers. When, before that was kind of a discipline. I was one of the younger associates that picked that as a practice before it was a pivot. And so I've grown up doing that. And then in recent times, I helped co-found our blockchain and digital assets group. And so the intersection of privacy and blockchain to me is something that I find very fascinating, and is a lot of fun. I don't know about a talent. Fun little fact is that when I was growing up, I skied almost every day as a kid.
Wow.
So
That's awesome.
That's a good one.
Really good. Sorry about that. My name is Wisniewski. I'm the CTO at Clear. Generally, this crowd would be pretty familiar with Clear, I think. It depends. But started with them a few years ago, and we are, at our core, the facade is sort of a very expedited experience for aviation security, but the philosophy and the idea is to actually do precisely that, bring sort of the real version, the philosophical version of you, the one that can rent a car or get on a plane or open a bank account, into a more convenient form, that form being very digital, being very tokenless, ideally. And so I've joined, my expertise is mostly as an engineer, mostly as an operator, as a scaler, as a creation of consumer products, and then over the last few years, bringing in as much as we can with the deep science of both identity as well as biometrics. So really, really excited to kind of dig into that, and we're coming at it from a lot of different angles. I'm just a hopeless sort of motorsports and car guy. I actually raced fairly seriously for a bit, cars, and I like to think I was pretty good. I'm a huge guy, and when I go go-karting, I generally win, so I gotta be okay at it. So that's, I guess that's a fun fact.
Nice. All right, now we know them a little bit better. So when we do open Q&A, you can either ask about those things or something related to identity and privacy and trust. So jumping right into the conversation here, coming back to Bimal, obviously you have built a career around building these frictionless experiences and really focusing on the consumer, which in digital identity terms is relatively unheard of. Obviously, Clear has done a very good job of it as well. Talk to me a little bit about, when you went to market, obviously this is a consumer show, so when you went to market, what were some of those consumer aspects that you had to keep in mind, some of those go-to-market strategies that you employed, and how did the market react to that from when you guys first started to where you are today?
So when we started, we really built it bottom up, putting ourselves in the shoe of the person receiving the product, and said, what do we want, right? And the first thing we said is, look, I want to preserve my privacy first and foremost. I want to have a zero friction element, and I want the same experience, whether it's on mobile, kiosk, telephone, as in calling a call center, or they're calling me, or even in person. How do I create that experience? And then we went to a series of financial institutions and kind of said, what do you think? And the first reaction was, why do we care? And I'm like, don't you want to protect the privacy of the consumer? And they're like, it's a loss. We write off the loss. And when I heard the fifth institution say that, it was kind of a wake-up call. And so then we had to look at it and say, well, what would make it worthwhile for you? They're like, well, can it help with fraud? Can it help with reducing my cost in some way? Can it help with this? And when we came back with a solution that goes ROI positive very quickly and delivers this amazing customer experience, we shifted from a technology buyer to a business buyer who actually cares about the brand and cares about the customer experience. And I think that was the transition point. When you talk about identity, not as an enabler for security, but identity is the heart of the relationship and the heart of transforming a customer experience and increasing share of wallet, increasing engagement levels, and protecting the brand, people have a very different reaction. And a couple of nice big hacks along the way helped us. And the first question we'd get is, well, would you have prevented these? And the answer is absolutely. And so that's one component. The other component was going to regulators who were at the beginning quite skeptical of saying, okay, so you're putting a defense and death platform together, everything's in one. Well, what if you're the single point of failure? What if you get hacked? And it was showing, the layering effect of the different technologies and saying, let's show you the kind of effort it would take to go through multiple layers. And yes, could there be a 0-day in there? But we were in use in stealth mode for quite a long time at some pretty big places. So that gave them comfort. And the regulators have now really put a lens on privacy, which I think is phenomenal. So if you go to Singapore, you go to India, you go to Indonesia, you go to Mexico, you have regulators that are, I would say a step ahead of the modern day regulators and are putting it at the forefront. And I think that's a big thing. And again, I come back to, whatever you build for the US market or the European market really has to work outside of those markets, especially when you deal with a very mobile user base.
Right, and obviously we've seen the proliferation of mobile devices and mobile adoption around the world. Has that been a major influence? How has that impacted your business, obviously?
Oh my God. 3 years ago, if you told me I would have an office in Mexico or in Kenya, I would have looked at you and said, did you have too much fun last night? And mobile adoption in Mexico went from 20% to over 75%. In Africa, it's the interaction point of choice. In Asia, it's the interaction point of choice. So that's really propelled not only the need, but the threat landscape has changed dramatically. Think about it. Every mobile device is a threat element for you now. And you not only have to worry about the digital identity, but you actually have to worry about protecting the mechanisms in that device from engineered malware, as well as wireless networks that are corrupted. And how do you do that? So it's a great opportunity, but it's created a very different set of challenges that I think when you take an enterprise solution and try to backfit it, it doesn't work, or it's too expensive, or it's a really bad experience.
Rob, I'm going to come over to you and talk a little bit about, same type of question. Obviously, Bimal and Uniken are working on a digital mobile-first solution. Obviously, you guys are more physical, right? We go talk to your reps, we scan our faces, we do all these things. One of the misconceptions about Clear is that you're trading, as a consumer, privacy for this convenience. Talk a little bit about, for one, of course, the same questions related to, how do you view physical identity solutions, but also to how have you gotten over this misconception, and how do you actually, as Clear, look at privacy and security as a managed identity provider?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So you can imagine the questions that come up when we're talking about our product, our service, our philosophies can get fairly deep and have a lot of gravity around them. And the best part of my job is having really clear and good, concise answers to precisely that. So around the privacy aspect, the most specific and I think universal response that we have in the way that we approach it is privacy, security, and fidelity are absolutely our core tenets. And that's not just like, oh, hey, we promise. That's literally in the business model. Our members are our customers. That's where our revenue comes from. That's where our a vast majority of all of the value that we have is that relationship and trust that we have with the customers. And in fact, the entire philosophy is about trying to share much less information for the purpose of enacting certain types of transactions. Our privacy policies and our plain English, and we're constantly revising them. Every time we look at it, we're like, we could do that a little bit better. We could keep adjusting it. The idea is to understand the relationship that you're getting into with Clear, and understanding that Clear right now is providing a swath of services that we fully recognize will probably be definitely regulated. In fact, we're already plenty regulated, but will be something like self-sovereign, right? They will be operated, they will be opt-in, they will be networks of networks, attestation. Identity will become this sort of layered concept between some financial institution-centric identity discovery, some government-run sort of identity participation, digital to physical identity. All those things will come together, and Clear is really about operating and servicing within all of those philosophies, providing what it needs to provide at this point, offering what it can with respect to the ideas and the general concepts, getting ideally a certain population or in certain use cases where it really does pay to be able to offer that type of service now, understanding that it will only become more and more pervasive, and just continuing to sort of integrate and operate on top of those networks. So privacy, very straightforward. We never sell data. It's built into our motivations and our actual, the shared goals that everybody has because of the way that we actually structure the business. Secondarily, from a security perspective, we started in the hardest areas. So we are regulated to FISMA High. We're actually, we have literal auditors come in regularly. FISMA High is considered mission critical loss of life. So all the type of information that would typically be considered, for all the scariest use cases, the standards that those are held to are the standards that we're held to. And then our journey and our job is to now figure out how to address for all of these different frameworks, and as we start to venture out globally, all these different frameworks, how do we provide that same level of fidelity coupled to the usefulness that it has? The best answer I can give is that CCPA, GDPR, it was sort of before we even knew what those were, as I was coming into Clear, I knew I wanted to work for a company that thought those things that GDPR is anyway, and I was asking those questions, and then when those started to come about, we've actually had to do shockingly little. Like our philosophies were already there. Right to be forgotten, for instance, is something that was a part of the company since it was refounded in 2010 by my bosses. And so with that, there's always little sort of implementation level details, but the guts of it were already in keeping with what I think the modern concept of privacy is, and ideally driving that forward. The idea being, if we can have an end-to-end secure, highly high fidelity identification token lists of who you are, let's say when you're buying a beer, now all of a sudden you're not, and we do this in Washington, we sell concessions in Washington, we're able to actually attest to age for identity, and in that case you're not showing any payment information, you're not showing your address and your driving status and your organ donor status to some random bouncer and then a server and then whatever. Like literally we handle the payment, we handle the attestation, and then the real gravity is around obviously the biometric and that core identity and keeping that and protecting it. So our job is to continue to stay at the very cutting edge, and then always weighing benefit and risk versus privacy and security. So that, the great part about Clear is that the answers are simple. The hard part is that you have to answer those because we're in the hard, the really tough areas, just like you. Like, it gets more complex and more crazy every single day. But if your philosophies are lined up, you're not trying to figure out, how do I sell everybody's data but still keep privacy? Like, that's not something that I need to worry about. So,
Right. And Joe, obviously, privacy has started to bubble up. You mentioned that this was something that you wanted to touch on your career, and you have done so successfully with Perkins. And it's safe to say now that we're at this point where privacy by design has started to gain some pretty good traction with the startup and developer community. We are starting to see traction. And if you aren't super familiar with privacy by design, it's basically a set of universal standards or principles to which product managers and engineers should build new products on top of. Obviously, it's very hard to take legacy infrastructure and then go backwards. And so that's kind of the intent. So we're obviously all talking about it, everything from a banking transaction to a travel transaction. Obviously, we didn't even touch about e-commerce. But before this session, we had a whole session up here about cryptocurrency and DLT, and this is something obviously that I believe you helped create at Perkins Coie, a whole group around this. Can you break down for us this idea of decentralized digital identity, what that is? I'm thinking self-sovereign identity. Both other panelists have mentioned self-sovereign identity so far. What is that at a high level, and is that something that everybody as a consumer in this room should be thinking about? Should we be downloading self-sovereign identity apps later this evening?
Mm-hmm. So, the real debate over self-sovereign identity, there's a question precedent to that, which is, do we trust a network of information that's centralized with a gatekeeper who knows what they're doing, or do we trust a network that's decentralized where you have the data under your own control? And so it asks a couple of questions, which are, do you trust the people making the software, and do you trust yourself? And trust is a big issue. And the reason that I think digital identity is becoming a big deal is on account of a few things. The first one is, through the mid-2000s, there was just an ever-increasing series of breaches. And I don't think there's probably anyone in this room that hasn't received at least one letter or email saying, we regret to inform you that your information was included in some data dump that got hacked. And there was that. And the most public of that was the Sony PlayStation breach, because it was handled so badly, right? Just by everyone involved. And that was a big tipping point for American consumers, where they sort of woke up and said, I'm not really safe online. And in Europe, when they passed GDPR, there's a fundamental thing that I think is important to realize, and that is that there's no constitutional right to privacy in the United States. Like, the Constitution does not have a provision for privacy. And in fact, we don't view it, nor do we treat it in the marketplace as a human right. Not yet, right? In Europe, they do. In Europe, your privacy is a fundamental human right. And I always am amazed when I work with my European counterparts, when we get in the midst of a deal and you're talking about representations and warranties, or you're doing privacy by design. You're like, well, that's kind of a gray area, so maybe we'll cut this corner. And they react very viscerally to that. They're like, wait, that's like, taking people's guns away in some very red state in the Union, right? Like, you just don't do that in Europe. And I think that the passage of the CCPA means a lot more than just a big regulation in a very aggressive state. It's a point at which, if you think about how that regulation started, it was two non-legislator advocates from the tech sector who, initiated an initiative that preyed upon people's, or played upon, depending on your take on it, right, on people's concerns about their feelings of vulnerability, that they couldn't protect themselves. And the interesting thing about the CCPA is that it expresses its regulatory reach in terms of rights. I don't know if people have thought about that, but that's actually quite unique in the way that it goes about what it's doing. Normally, a regulation governs risk, or it governs action. But in California, under the CCPA, there's a group of consumer rights that people can, they can claim. So you can go to a company and say, I have a right to delete my data. I have a right to know what you collect about me. Now, being in the space, it is uncanny how often I encounter companies from small to very large who have no idea what they collect. They've never really done a data assessment. They've never really sat down and asked themselves, what do I collect? What do I do with it? Who do I share it with? And interestingly enough, when we do that work for them, they're often surprised at how porous their organization actually is. And so that's a roundabout way of saying, I think we're in the very middle of a pretty large debate, which is, do we want identity providers who are focused on, like Clear and like Uniken, on very structured, secure, sometimes single purpose with a very sharp focus data aggregation and protection for things like, I do travel data. I don't have to sell it because I make money just getting your membership, right? Or do we want to create a network where those entities have a purpose, but they're not going to be a one-size-fits-all, where there is something of sorts like you have a wallet full of your credentials that you get to choose for yourself, self-sovereign. You get to choose for yourself what you do with your credentials. If you want to prove you're over 21, you've got 5 ways to do it. And you can open your digital wallet and choose which things you want to expose for that purpose, depending on how sensitive they are to you. I'll end that just by saying that I don't really know which one's going to win. You know, we're in the middle of the VHS and beta wars, and I have no idea which of those tendencies is going to win out. I have a horse I like, but...
Yeah, absolutely. And from our point of view, I mean, obviously at OWI we get to, you know, we monitor over 10,000 companies. You know, and we try to find out what are they doing, what are they buying, how are they reviewing these things, and it seems as of right now it's a parallel path, but you know, one is obviously veering towards the other. So we'll find out when that collision point happens, of course. And I think you brought up a really interesting point, and I want to bring it back to the consumer angle here just a little bit more. Bimal, you know, you've been building digital identity systems. There hasn't really been a consumer identity product that's been super successful outside of password managers and frankly Clear, not just because you're up here. Right. Thanks. But you know, there hasn't really been many very successful consumer identity apps. Is digital identity, does it need to be a consumer application, or is it really just a golden cog that has to be placed in every machine in the future?
I think it's a golden cog. I think when you say a digital application, if it's a standalone application, it's failed already, right? It really needs to be a cog in every institution's mobile app. So whether it's travel, it's hospitality, it's retail, it's government services, or it's financial services, we believe it's a cog. We built a platform that is a cog because as a consumer, I don't want different applications for that need, right? Now, if we get to a state of self-sovereign where I have choice, I can embed it in a mobile app, and I can do that, right? Then maybe maybe that cog becomes the strengthened element of that self-sovereign identity. But certainly, you know, I think we're maybe not even at the middle. We're maybe even in the early stages, because every time I think I have a understanding of the landscape, I see something happen in an emerging market that changes my view. And I think that's the amazing thing, that the global nature of the ask and the global nature of the issue says that people are taking very different approaches to this. And you know, the benefit of us not starting in the US was we kind of have a global platform from the beginning, and it's given us a different perspective, and I think that's why we're growing leaps and bounds, and maybe some of the other people trying to do this are not, because they've taken more of a North American-centric approach, which you know, doesn't really work in many places.
Right. And Rob, I'll take it to you. I mean, you had to know this question was coming. Obviously, you guys have seen some pretty good adoption at the consumer level. As a CTO, right, for us techies out there, you're kind of you're the top of the chain for us. What would you say, like, you know, what is your position on how you were able to achieve the consumer growth that you have? And what would be some advice that you would give to the folks in the room that are trying to build identity applications for a consumer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, CTO just means it's all your fault. So I wouldn't be too quick on that one. I think a lot of the opportunity that we've found has been really acting as the consumer's advocate. And I don't want to get back into the last question, but people really do respond to like, this is doing something for me. I mean, if you think about what we're avoiding, the alternatives are pretty terrible right now. And we're kind of looking for that in other places, ways and shapes and forms. We do all the normal things, stay lean and do experiments and, really excited about, the ability to grow that things like the cloud allow us to do. There's just no way you could do this with the initial margins that I know Clear went through in order to discover and start to build and understand and learn and evolve what they needed. Karen always likes to say that, it took 7 years to get the first 1 million users and then 7 months to get the second 1 million, right? But those 7 years were really long years, right? So it's about, in that case, persistence and experimentation and understanding. In the end, it's really that core business model. I mean, to get back to this, I do think it's an embedding. I think it's, let's look at the Apple ecosystem, right? The Apple ecosystem, the only reason payment starts to get some traction is because you have this singular sort of, it's connected to that one device. I have an answer for a future question that I think is going to sort of bring us up above that, but that's all the Apple ecosystem, but I can embed a train ticket, I can embed a credential. My CES barcode was in there, right? It needs to boil down to a singular where it's many facades of a singular concept and people start to grok it. They grok Clear because it's like, I want to get through the line, okay, they understand, but sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes you do have to take them 1 or 2 levels into what, we've just agreed with you on your identity. And now we're allowing you to access that identity with biometrics. Nothing about your biometrics told us who you were. You just proved to us who you were like you prove to everybody every day. And then we're using those biometrics in order to connect to that work very quickly. And then you kind of say it to them like that. They're like, oh, so, well, we can do that anytime. We can show out your ID. And like, yeah, but hold on. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? We look at a lot of experimentations. We're looking at ways to make, for instance, biometric boarding. You saw that in Delta this morning. Biometric boarding is really, really exciting. But until you get a highly tuned, very, very simple version of it, it's not that much harder than this device that you typically have. And that is an extremely controversial statement coming from somebody who's literally trying to sell biometric boarding, right? So, but what I mean by that is we will not get into that space beyond pilots and experiments until we understand why we're offering value. So we do operate with some partners biometric boarding for international travel via the CBP TVS system. Now, that's useful because you're showing passport, right? But just literally anybody who has possession of a boarding pass being allowed to get in, you're competing with that. So it's all about what you're competing with and then starting to open people's minds with respect to that sort of transaction interaction concept. What have they really bought into? It's understanding and unification. That's what we found really helps. And so we're looking for common vocabulary, common experiences. And the more people use it, that whole network effect, whatever, we want to go from, twice a month to twice a day to 10 times a day. And that's the thing that people start to really dig into. And that network effect was huge for us. I mean, finding the partners that got us to where we were able to go. So.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense with the network effect. I mean, I won't even travel with employees that don't have Clear anymore. I'm like, you can go to the airport on your own. I don't want you on. I don't, just go away. So, yeah.
And if it's at your destination and you have it coming back, you're just that much more likely to be like, okay, what is this thing, and will it help? And we see that with concessions. Like, wait, they didn't even show their ID; they just got their beer. That was great. Skipping a line's also cool, but eventually that line will come back a little bit. But if that line's moving faster, well, great. And then wait, I didn't have to show them where I live. That's pretty cool. There's this add-on compounding effect, but people, it's a nuanced thing, and in a headline world, it's a really tough sort of mountain to climb.
Sure. And I know we're running out of time here, but I want you guys to pull out your crystal ball, think about the future. Obviously, this is a tech conference, so let's think about that. But I'm going to go round robin. You guys got 1 minute, right? Tell me either what you think that everybody in this room should take away from today, or what is the next future technology, or just one prediction that you want to make about the future that everyone's going to judge you on if you're wrong. All right, so why don't we start in the middle here?
Well, I think that I'll say it this way. I bought access to a password manager for my family, and that was 5 months ago, and I'm the only one that uses it. And the reason I'm the only one that uses it is because it takes about 45 minutes to figure out how to do it and another hour to move from where you were to where you need to be. And then after that, it's the coolest thing I've ever used. I really, really do like it. And so my prediction is that digital identity is going to remain a grail out in the future. As valuable and important and amazing as it is, until they pull the hat trick that Clear pulled, for example, and make it easy to get in and use, and it becomes a golden cog where you don't really see it, it just works. I don't foresee it coming as fast as we all need it to, because the way I joined Clear was I went with a colleague who was heading towards the Clear line, and he looked at me like I was like an infant and said, "You don't have Clear?" And he grabbed my arm and marched me to the line and said, "You get reimbursed for this." And I'm like, I didn't know that. And 11 minutes later, I was sitting in the boarding area.
Average is 5.5.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. So it was really, so that's my prediction, is that I don't think that digital identity is going to get out of the race until those barriers go way, way down.
Sure. Bimal.
So, I do think it's getting easier. There are technologies that are getting better. I think the prediction I would tell you is something our clients asked for this last year, which is as you solve that cog problem in digital identity, the weak point becomes the enrollment. And identity proofing and identity verification become really big elements of the solution. So that's forced us to kind of embed that element into our solution this last year. And if I look at the number of people asking that, I would say 9 out of 10 clients moving forward are asking us for the full solution, which includes identity proofing and identity verification at enrollment.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've been moving from the authentication piece up the work stream to the consumer at that identity proofing, identity verification point. Rob, last prediction.
I'll stay super tech because I'm like just a hopeless engineer. I've seen this sort of abstraction and virtualization train come for the deep professional stuff and into the consumer stuff and into the now cars and not really owning anything. It might be somewhat controversial, probably maybe horizon of more like 5 years, but I think we will find a world where the devices themselves become more abstract. And I know that sounds weird coming from a Clear. We're trying to be tokenless where we can, though we're not. We have an app, we love it. It's great. We should definitely have tokens as backups to things, whatever. But I think I would love to pick up anybody's phone and it becomes my phone immediately. Why don't I pick up my iPad? You got 5G, you've got great connectivity, you've got pretty much apps and everything that actually sort of works via cloud and the abstraction of all that anyway. Why is anything local, or why is it not almost seamlessly becoming that? Sit in any car, it becomes your car. You grab any device, it becomes your device. I don't think we're as far away from an experience like that. Obviously not everything, not pervasive, not pick up any phone, but I could have a few of them. Why does this stuff not feel that way? And it sort of connects both tech and identity in that way too,
So you guys all heard it here. Those are the predictions for the future from these panelists. I predict we're going to get kicked off the stage here any second. So can you please join me in a round of applause for these panelists?
Thank you.
Thank you.